First up, I've got my picture profile set to a custom, very flat setting. Now, you can either create your own custom setting, or you can use a flat log profile like C-Log or S-Log, depending on your camera's manufacturer. And this is gonna give you the most neutral contrast, the most neutral saturation, and all the other settings as possible, so that in post-production, you can then selectively turn up and increase the parameters that you want. So I have my sharpness set very low, which is basically a parameter that the camera adds an overall crispness to your footage. The less the sharpness, the more soft your image will look. The higher the sharpness, the more razor sharp the edges of the pixels in your image are gonna look. Next up is contrast. I've got this turned all the way down, and the same goes for saturation as well, because I wanna be able to selectively turn these up in my edit to really get the levels that I want. So rather than having them set high, and then when you bring it into your editing software, you have to turn things down, you're better off keeping these low so you just don't have to fix your footage later on. Now, color tone, I leave this neutral set to 0. If you decrease the color tone, you're gonna make the skin tones in your image appear more reddish. Now, if you increase your color tone, the skin tones will then start to have more of a yellowish tint to them. So depending on your skin tone, depending on your lighting, you can adjust these, but personally, I leave this set to 0. Next up is white balance, and this really comes down to the temperature of light that's coming from your light source. And this parameter of color temperature is called the Kelvin. Now, the lower that number, let's say 1900 Kelvin, that's gonna be an extremely warm source of light, like a candle. The higher the Kelvin rating, like let's say 5600, that's gonna be direct sunlight, which is actually a lot more of a bluish. So every type of light bulb that you're using has a different overall warmth or coolness that's rated on this color temperature scale. Now, my lighting source is at 5600 Kelvin. So if I set my white balance to 5600 Kelvin, that means the colors in my image are gonna be neutral. It's not gonna look too yellowish or orange, and then it's not gonna look too bluish or cold. So to get natural skin tones, you really wanna get your white balance really close to the overall color temperature of your lighting source. Now, depending on your camera type, it may also come with a white balance shift function. This is just gonna give you a little bit more control over the overall color tonality of your image. I personally drop this down a few points towards the more reddish and purplish tones. This is gonna take out any kind of extra green that might be in the image. Sometimes this happens with using artificial lighting, where the skin tone will kind of have this greenish, yellowish tone that makes you look a little bit sick or under the weather. Since I know that ahead of time from years of shooting, I personally drop this down a little bit, but don't worry, if you don't have this function in your camera, you can easily do this in post-production. Next up is the volume setting. Now, this is the same process that we kind of already talked about, where you want to set your settings to manual so that you're peaking somewhere between -12 and -6. You really don't want to go above that, and you really don't want to go too far below that. So even though I'm not going to be using the audio from my camera in my final edits, what I am going to use it for is syncing my really good sounding audio out of my Zoom to the footage of my camera. Now, the rest of these shots of my settings are a little bit blurry, so I'm going to switch to using title cards on screen. So for my frame rate and record settings, I'm going to be shooting at 24 frames a second, because this is going to help to give your image a much more soft movie feel versus 30 frames, which is the way that TV broadcasts, the news stations, all that kind of content uses 30 frames a second. It feels a little bit plasticky. Now for frame rate, exposure, aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, I have full courses that dive really deep into these topics. So I'm just gonna kind of do an important overview of the most important things to pay attention to. But if you want more information, you can check out those other courses. Now, because my frame rate is at 24 frames a second, it is industry standard to set your shutter speed at double that, which is setting your shutter at a 50th of a second. This is going to create the most natural motion blur, and that all films use this to really create that soft film type aesthetic. The higher the shutter speed, the more crisp and strobe-like the image is, and the more hyper-realistic it feels. The lower the shutter speed, the more soft each frame will feel. For aperture, I'm shooting on a 24 to 70 millimeter 2.8, and I've got my aperture set all the way open. The lower the aperture, the more light is entering the camera and the shallower the depth of field. This is what we really want to go for, especially when you're talking to camera. You want that nice crisp focus where you're razor sharp and the background behind you has got that nice blurred out look. So I'd highly suggest, with whatever lens you're shooting with, bringing your aperture all the way down to really get that blurred out background. And lastly, we have our ISO. Now this is what boosts the overall exposure of the image. The higher the ISO, the brighter the image, but that's gonna give us more of that digital noise. The lower the ISO, the less the image is boosted, which means it's gonna be darker and there's gonna be less digital noise. For my specific scene, the way my light is set up, the perfect setting for the ISO is 1600. And you're gonna wanna find what ISO you don't wanna go above on your camera. Each camera's different, but for my 1DX Mark II, I know that I don't really want to go above 2000 because for my eyes, that gives just a little too much of the digital noise in the dark parts of the image. But that could be a completely different number if you're shooting on your phone or a Sony camera or a really good low light camera. You're going to want to find that sweet spot where you're getting the perfect exposure, but your image still looks really clean.